Thank you much, Father Mariusz. It's a pleasure to start off this lecture series. And as Father Mariusz, you mentioned, this is going to be a primarily or almost exclusively philosophical lecture, and in some ways, almost exclusively, well, historical and philosophical, kind of trying to understand conversations about causality. And that, I think, is, in one sense, a kind of constrained conversation, and yet in another sense, it's a massive conversation because causation and the notions of causation have, stretched back to the earliest conversations in philosophy. And so I am going to do my best to be very, very focused and constrained on the topic at hand, particularly ordering them towards the kinds of conversations around causality and causation that have been impactful in more recent conversations on divine action. So the title of the talk that is Theories of Causation, or it could also be subtitled Three Books You Should Read About Causation, because I relied very heavily on three particular books, one very briefly, the other two more largely, and they go into much more depth than I could possibly cover in a 45-minute lecture. And I highly encourage those who are interested to take a look at each of them. The broad outline of this talk is that I'm going to very, very briefly, in 2 slides, present the Aristotelian Thomistic account of the causes. And again, this is perhaps something that is familiar to many of our listeners from previous lecture series. I'll then go through a way too brief history of causation, focusing on changes in the conversation of causality and causation, particularly those that influence sort of Anglo-American conversations around causation in the 20th century. And then I will dive into a kind of brief taxonomy of contemporary Anglophone theories of causation. And the three books correspond to the three sort of sections here. The first book is a very wonderful book by Gloria Frost that dives into really great and robust detail about Aquinas on efficient causation. And I just highly recommend, this is just mainly just an excuse to recommend her book, because if you want a sophisticated account of what what Aquinas has to say about efficient causation and causation in general, it's a great reference. For the history section, I'll be relying on the work of Father William Wallace from his 2-volume Causality and Scientific Explanation, which I'll say a bit more about when I get there. And for the final section, I'm relying on a familiar face, Father Mariusz Tabacek, and some of his work, particularly in his book on emergence towards a new metaphysics of philosophy of science. So to begin with, just again, very briefly in 2 slides, just reminding / presenting what a brief picture of the Thomistic account of causation before we move into a different direction. Again, in one sense, you can summarize very easily what an Aristotelian account of the causes are. There are 4 of them: the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, the final cause. Quoting Aristotle's physics, the material cause is broadly that out of which something comes to be and which persists. The formal cause, the form or archetype, the statement of the essence. The efficient cause, the primary source of the change or coming to rest. The final cause, the end, or that for the sake of which a thing is done. For anyone who has actually studied these 4 causes, you know that there's so much more that would need to be said about each of them. And as a kind of promissory note towards that, I present here just a sort of text or a discussion of efficient causality that Gloria Frost presents in her wonderful book on Aquinas's Aquinas's account of efficient causation. And I present it here because it points to and references towards the depth and complexity of this seemingly simple picture of 4 causes. She argues that to actually describe any one account or event or occasion of efficient causality, the kind of paradigm case of per se efficient causality, will have 8 aspects to it: 4 on the side of the agent, 4 on the side of the one acting, 4 on the side of the patient. Very briefly, you could say that you have to accounting for the agent itself, the one who the substance or thing that is acting. There is the action that is being done by the agent, but that is distinct from the active power through which the agent is acting, as well as that towards which that action is the natural inclination that action is ordered towards. On the side of the patient, the thing being acted on, there is the patient itself, the substance being acted on, the passive power that is capable of receiving the action in some way, and then separately, both the motion, the actual movement of the patient being acted on, as well as the passion, the motion considered as received by the patient. And I just bring this up to reference that even though here we're talking about efficient causality, under the hood, all four causes are present. The natural inclination implies a connection to final causality. The active power implies a particular kind of form, a particular accidental form that is the grounds for the possibility of the action. And the passive power implies both something formal and something material. The fact that there is a potency in the patient to receive a particular kind of action. So even though we might easily lay out the four causes of Aristotle as the material, the formal, the efficient, the final, and sometimes speak of them completely separately, any one account of causality is going to draw on and bring out that complexity. So I've already spent probably too much time on this, but I just want to lay that out as a kind of background for the conversation we're going to go through and that we'll hopefully return to at the end. So now I begin my way too brief history of causation. And there is this way too brief history of causation is going to follow a pattern that often frustrates me of picking on the most loud and strange, or not so loud, I guess, in one sense most influential, but also influential because very new and novel accounts of causation. Depending on who you're talking to, this is often presented as a very simplistic picture of a positive change or a very simplistic picture of a negative change, where we can trace the fall away from Aristotelian causality or the success of modern science over Aristotelian causality by just marking off certain people. But I want to begin with a quote from Father William Wallace's book on causality and scientific explanation. This two-volume work beginning from ancient philosophy going all the way up to 1970s when he published it. And here he's summarizing, after having gone through the period of kind of the scientific revolution through right up to the cusp of contemporary science. He summarizes his reflections on this period. And he says, contrary to a widespread impression, the passage from medieval and Renaissance science to classical science was not affected by, nor even accompanied by, an abrupt change in methodology, as this relates to causal analysis. Aristotle went into eclipse with the rise of modern science, it is true, and with him, the style and analysis of argumentation that characterized the peripatetic and scholastic treatises on natural philosophy. Yet, contrary to the general conception, the search for causes was not abandoned, nor did causal knowledge cease overnight to be a goal to which scientists aspired. So if you simply thought that the history of causality is the four figures I'm going to mention in a moment, it might look like the exact opposite of what Father William Wallace is saying, that there's just a simple progression away from the Aristotelian notion of causality or the notion of causation at all. But I will point out with reference, namely just very briefly to names, that in the midst for every one of these figures who is moving in a strong direction away from the Aristotelian mode of talking or causation at all, there are figures who are responding in reaction to them. As you might, the joy of learning the history of science, the history of philosophy, is that it's a lot more complex than the simple pictures we often paint. That said, here is the simple picture I'm going to paint. So we can begin. There is, arguably, there is a broad consistency in the scholastic mode, drawing on Aristotle of talking about causality until the early modern period, and a major figure in shifting away from that scholastic mode is René Descartes. Again, in the early 17th century, and a large part of his account of causation downplayed and reduced formal and final causes. And reduced explanations down to inert matter and physical efficient causes that really are just the motion of that matter and the transfer of motion from one bit of matter to another. So while it might look like the world is this complex story of action and passion with things burning and colors passing left and right and changes in temperature and color and density, things being eaten and things being swallowed, all of those proximate causes are ultimately to be explained or derived by a certain kind of necessary deduction from the smallest parts of inert matter and their motions. Now, interestingly, just as an aside, for him, God is, in a certain sense, the ultimate source of this motion, the ultimate efficient cause in this story, and the guarantor of the laws governing the transfer or motion between the bodies. He's even hesitant to talk about kind of the bodies themselves having efficient causality per se. It really is just things pushing on things in a kind of motion. So again, we here have a major shift away from certain aspects of the Aristotelian picture, reducing the story of causality down to the smallest pieces and their motion. And yet, just to remind ourselves, at the very same time that René Descartes is publishing this, William Harvey is publishing on discoveries about blood, where he is explicitly using all four Aristotelian causes. And in the generations after René Descartes, there is a reaction against this very corpuscularian vision of causes, and this particularly the idea that everything needs to be explained by, must be explained by the smallest pieces and how they move and push. Leibniz moves in a different direction, focusing on the forces themselves rather than the pieces and parts. Isaac Newton rejects the possible or would like to know what the smallest pieces and parts are and would like to be able to describe those causes, but says that we have to work through experimental data to get there, and we're not there yet. So René Descartes is hugely influential, but not singular in this conversation. Jumping ahead, the next figure that sort of fits into the history of this conversation is David Hume, again, jumping over a few generations. And again, arguably he and a few of his predecessors are responding to the failure of the Cartesian project, that Descartes' attempt to simply explain everything deductively from the motion of the smallest pieces isn't really working. That's not the mode that the physics of Isaac Newton is built on. That's not the mode by which physics is being successful. And there's a kind of skepticism about verifying the causal explanations rooted in the moving about of the smallest pieces. And for Hume, that leads to a skepticism about varying any causal explanations at all. And so, to vastly oversimplify, he proposes a way of psychologically justifying our use of causal language. That when we talk about causes, what's really going on is that the idea of a kind of necessary connection between cause and effect among one event happening followed by another arises when there is a similar number of instances which occurs of the constant conjunction of these events. And he talked about how the mind is carried by habit from cause to effect. He's denying that there is anything in reality that we can point to as telling us that there is this necessary connection of cause and effect, that he is reducing the diagnosis of causation down to one event happening followed by another, and a necessary connection. But that necessary connection is not something in reality itself, but something that the mind is carried to by the habit of constant conjunction of these events. Again, the broader corpus of Hume himself is much more interesting and complicated in ways that Father Wallace points out. How consistent is he throughout this? And yet this broad pattern he proposes does end up being hugely influential, and yet has reactions too. You can point to Thomas Reid, a kind of proponent of a kind of common sense notion of philosophy, arguing that, okay, perhaps certain kinds of causality might be fundamentally about necessary, like the constant conjunction that we recognize, and yet arguing that there really must be some more fundamental efficient causality undergirding that. And arguably, Immanuel Kant tries to ground efficient causality much more concretely in reality in the notion of forces coming out of Newtonian physics. So while Hume is hugely influential, he's not monolithic in this conversation either. Again, jumping ahead to two more figures who are hugely influential in this conversation, particularly the Anglo-American conversation about philosophy, philosophy of science. Um, very, very briefly, you can point to Auguste Comte, who simply, as the father of positivism, arguably the father of philosophy of science, as some would declare, who simply declared that science just should not search for causes. That's not what it's meant for. All it should be doing is laying out laws of phenomena. And it's not even trying to explain anything at all. All it's for is trying to predict what's going to happen. Arguably, Mill agrees with Comte, although perhaps softens the language a bit. He broadly adopts Hume's characterization of causes as events, which are related to effects purely on phenomenal terms. And he argues that whatever we might say about the law of causation, all it is our recognition of a kind of invariability of one set of events followed by another. The law of causation consists in this, that every consequent is connected invariably with some particular antecedent or set of antecedents. And here he's meaning this in a very deflationary account, where it's just the way in which we recognize what's going on in the phenomenon, not about the something fundamental in reality. Again, as influential and important as Comte and Mill are on certain conversations in the philosophy of science, in their own day, there are scientists and philosophers of science who are arguing, broadly speaking, the exact opposite. That no, science is fundamentally about seeking for causes. That is fundamentally about explaining what's going on in the natural world. In fact, going so far as to argue for very realist accounts of gravitational forces, of causality in the physics of their day. So while Comte and Mill have a huge influence on later conversations, they're not monolithic either. So again, this leads into the story of the 20th century, the kind of rise of the dominant paradigm of philosophy of science. And to kind of very briefly characterize it, I draw on a quote from a section that Father Wallace uses, which is a reference to a lecture given in the 1950s about the decline and fall of causality in conversations in the sciences. And there are lots of points you could point to here. One of the primary ones, though, is the overturning of determinism and classical determinism with quantum mechanics. That if the world is not deterministic, what room is there for necessary causal connections? This idea that causal connections, if people argued for them, were so deeply connected to necessary causes, deterministic necessary causes of forces, when that idea gets overturned, the very idea of causality seems to fall away. Arguably, there are various figures here, different sort of paradigms for thinking about what science are that are distinct from one another, but what is quite common about all of them is this downplaying of causal language, downplaying of the notion of laws and explanation in general. And this, while there's lots of subdivisions here, the broad dominant paradigm for talking about the sciences or the philosophy of science, and that was being communicated to scientists themselves, inherited was logical positivism at the bottom here, just skipping ahead a bit, inherited this anti-metaphysical attitude of Comte and attempted to reduce all meaning to logical consistency, empirically verifiable observation, was very broadly dismissive of causal language or rejected it in certain ways. I put here just an and yet slide just to say that for that same dominant paradigm is going on and continued in the early 20th century, there were figures pushing against it in different ways. Not many specifically Thomist per se or Aristotelian, and yet there were rejections of this broader paradigm, openness to causal laws in various ways, openness to realism and metaphysical claims in the sciences going on as well. So I want to I'll end my historical survey there, just pointing to the fact that for the conversation that of contemporary philosophy of science and contemporary analytic metaphysics that has come out of this broad paradigm of the early 20th century that saw a kind of discounting of and rejection of causal language. There is a interesting story for why it is that that has reversed. But for the sake of time, I'm going to jump ahead to, well, what is it that's, what is it what is it that contemporary scientists or contemporary philosophers are saying about causality? And just to point out, though, that in many ways, the kind of initial return to causality generally sort of follows the reverse of the pattern that we talked about. Insofar as people are looking to talk about causality, they're looking back to figures like Mill, figures like Hume, before jumping straight to Aristotle. So now I present, again, way too briefly, a kind of timeline or a taxonomy of contemporary analytic theories of causation. And again, here I'm drawing very much on the work of Father Mariusz. And for the first several of these are attempts to take the kind of Humean picture of causation, broadly speaking, return to that and yet make it slightly more robust, perhaps, in a way that is accessible to contemporary science, more so in a more concrete way. Again, Hume specifically connected constant conjunction to just this sort of habit of mind. And most contemporary analytic philosophers who want to talk about causality want to say that there's something real about causality, perhaps, that it is, but it's not simply something that we are imposing on the world. But they don't want to say that that there are causal powers or causal things in the world. And so the kind of language is trying to diagnose our language around causality, and clarify what we mean when we talk about causes and effects. And they often, and most of these, follow the same broad pattern of what must be the case to say that event C causes event E. So the first of these, very closely related to Hume's view, is the regularity view. Event C causes an event E if and only if C is spatiotemporally contiguous with C. It's connected to it at some point in space and time. That E succeeds C in time. E follows, comes after C. And all events of type C are constantly conjoined with events of type E. Now, again, unlike Hume, most of the adherents of this view today argue that these constant conjunctions are real mind-independent regularities in the world, things that we have discovered using science in the world, but that they're just regularities, that they're mind-independent regularities. The issue for many of these is, well, how do we distinguish between conditions that are merely a kind of accidental temporal order? It just so happens that night follows day, and yet do we want to say that night causes day? Or that day causes night, and versus ones that are more causally relevant. And there are various conditions that people have tried to argue for where we can identify when this constant conjunction, when this regularity is something we're finding in nature, finding in the world, versus just a kind of accidental feature. Again, way too quickly, another view that sort of is not fully satisfied with that account from Hume, draws on a few other things that Hume and others have said, where it says, well, when we're talking about causation, what we really want to say is follows a kind of counterfactual pattern. What it means for C to cause event E is, well, if it were not the case that C happened, then it would not be the case that E happened. If C is causing E, well, if C didn't happen, then E wouldn't. And yet, is this more than just a conceptual analysis? How do we, insofar as we generally speaking, look for causes when we recognize effects, what do we mean when we're saying that E did not happen? What does it mean to put a kind of robustness on the counterfactual situation where E did not happen? And many defenses of this counterfactual view turn to a grounding of modality, possibility in the notion of possible worlds, arguing that we can conceive of worlds very, very similar to this one, where C did not happen, and then we can judge whether we think E would have been the case there. But again, there are debates among contemporary philosophers about whether that sort of reasoning is circular or not, whether that sort of ontological argument for possible worlds is defensible or not, is robust or not. And it still falls into some of the worries about accidental regularities versus, properly speaking, what we would actually want to talk about as a causal regularity. Not just the fact that something followed something else, but that something really led it to happen. Jumping ahead, another view is, well, in the light of particularly the fact that quantum mechanics and other aspects of sciences are so built in, the notion of probability is at least very useful in the sciences, if not arguably built into it in the indeterministic aspect of quantum mechanics. There are arguments that we should build probability into our account of causality, that event C is a probabilistic cause of an event E if, given that C has obtained, the probability of the occurrence of E has increased and is now higher than the probability of E if C had not obtained. So basically, if the cause happens, it's more likely that the event is going to happen. So we're loosening the necessity claim, the claim that C necessarily precedes E or E necessarily follows C, but just that if C happened, it's more likely. Put it mathematically, the probability of E given C is greater than the probability of E given not C. And again, this is a useful analysis and sort of conveys certain aspects of the kind of probabilistic way that we analyze a lot of contemporary sciences. But there are arguments that it might not, and while it might apply helpfully when we're thinking about lots of cases all at once, it's argued, you can point to cases where the probabilities don't line up with our intuitions about causality. If we're talking about a single case, it might be the fact that the probability has increased, and yet we don't really want to talk about that as causality, or vice versa. And so this pattern that seems to generally work on large scales doesn't necessarily work when we bring it down to an individual case. Another argument about that is in some ways in reaction to some of these broader analyses of causation is saying, well, look, this insistence on constant conjunction, this insistence on regularity, upon repeatability, that's just not how we think about causation. When we think about causation, we are usually analyzing one thing that happened and looking for the one thing that preceded it. So this has led to the argument that we should think about causation is primarily, it must be defined in terms of single cases of causal dependence between some cause and some event E, where C is some particular change in the immediate environment in a particular situation. And if that cause occurred right before that event, then then we identify that as the cause. And laws and regularities are seen as unimportant or unnecessary for most causal events. If we're looking for the explanation for why I tripped walking down the hall, I'm going to look for something in the environment right around where I tripped for what led me to do that. And again, this fits our intuition, adds something to our analysis of cause and effect, but it's not exactly clear how could you generalize this to talk about cause and effect in more general situations? It might follow the pattern by which we do tend to analyze situations we're interested in, but it's not clear whether we can say general things about the causal patterns of nature as a whole if we always focus on or are limited to focusing on the single event at a time. Another view that has been brought in to try and understand or diagnose the situations where our intuitions about cause and effect most seem clearest is this broad category of what are referred to as manipulability views, or views that look to the possibility or the actuality of manipulation. And it's broadly summed up is if the relationship between cause and effect has a causal character, then some manipulation of the cause brings about some relative change in the effect. And this draws on the intuition that most of the time, when we come to know causal relations, it's when we are manipulating things. When we go and change something and see what happens because of that, that is a how we understand that what we have changed is a cause of that effect, and not vice versa. Um, so that we look to those cases where we can change one factor and it brings about a change in something else, and we recognize that, okay, this must be the cause of the other. Insofar as I, example brought up of a pendulum, the pendulum, the period of a pendulum depends upon the length of the string. I can manipulate the length of the string, and that will change the period of the pendulum, but I can't manipulate the period of the pendulum to change the length of the string. That there's a kind of order there, the manipulation goes in one direction but not the other, and that there's a certain sort of causalness between of that notion of what I can manipulate to bring about some other change. And yet, is that enough to account for all all aspects of causality? Is causality only relevant insofar as we or some actor is able to act and engage to change the situation? And again, there have been extensions on this sort of most basic version that have attempted to better constrain and specify the kind and context of manipulation that might be useful for clarifying cause and effect. And yet there are still worries about invoking particular kind of human agency or an abstract free agency might be anthropomorphizing the situation, or if possibility where we can find situations where, yes, we manipulate one thing and something else changes, but we don't necessarily want to say that that's a situation of cause and effect. So if you have light bouncing off of a mirror at a certain angle, and you change the angle of incidence, that will change the angle of reflection. But do we want to say that that's cause and effect or not, or is that just the pattern by which light reflects? And this is something that contemporary philosophers have debated about the usefulness of that way of speaking. And then we can bring in the notion of a kind of a process view of causality that tries to lean into an understanding of the kind of dynamism in the natural world, and in particular some of the mathematics and claims in physics about aspects of how we think about sort of space-time and the patterns of conservation and energy flow in physical situations. Broadly speaking, this process view tries to shift away from emphasis on events per se, and says, well, we can talk about a causal process as the means by which structure and order are propagated or transmitted from one space-time region to another, to other times and places. And then we can talk about causal interactions as temporally simultaneous interactions of such processes. And they are the means by which modifications of structure, which are propagated by causal processes, are produced. So a causal process is something that is, in a certain sense, a kind of natural phenomenon flowing through space-time in a kind of regular pattern. It could be something as simple as a beam of light, or a particular, a ball flowing through the air. And if that causal process comes into an intersection with another causal process, there might be a modification of the structure such that the light no longer continues straight but reflects off of a mirror, or the ball interacts with something and modifies the structure by which that causal process is produced and propagated. Again, there are really interesting and fascinating reflections on causality that come out of this, but there are debates and questions about whether this captures everything that we want to say about causality as a whole, whether or not this gives us all of the language we need to convey our intuitions about how causal powers and processes actually work. So these first several sets of accounts of how causality works arguably try to do, in a certain sense, the least or add the least structure to reality, and are really about trying to identify a kind of arguably Humean way of talking about causality, or broadly Humean way, where we're trying to diagnose causality in the world, but in a world that is primarily about events happening, about physical objects obeying broad patterns of physical laws, about processes flowing through space-time, that we're trying to be, in a certain sense, agnostic, or add as little to the structure of the way we think about reality beyond simply the physical objects and their obeying of certain patterns and laws of nature. Um, in in reaction to this, there has been a kind of insistence that no, this is not enough. This is not, trying to simply go back to Hume, trying to simply resurrect a kind of Humean analysis of causation is not going to give us enough. That we need to actually talk about a real causal power in the world. That things in the world actually act on one another. They don't just, that it's not just events happening, processes playing out, that there is real action in and amongst the things of the world. And so a kind of brief description of the dispensationalist view, the idea that there are real causal dispositions or powers in the world, is that causation is a manifestation of reciprocal causal powers. Where, again, what are these words? Causal power. It's a disposition to engage in a certain kind of process, a kind of causal process. And what is manifestation? It's an ontologically distinct from, but necessarily related to, its causal power. It's the way that causal power actually manifests under the right conditions. So, in a certain sense, you might say, wait, hey, we're back. Have we just come back to Aristotle already? We're back talking about a power and its manifestation, or a disposition and its manifestation. And well, yes, that might be different words than Aristotle or Aquinas might use, but there are echoes here of that Aristotelian notion of act and potency. And yet, we need to be very careful here because, again, there are, insofar as there have been lots of really interesting and fascinating conversations about dispositions in contemporary philosophy of science, we need to be careful about jumping too quickly to claim that we're back to a Aristotelian view as such. Just as a kind of clarifier on this, again, if we want to understand the range of dispositionalist views of causality, we have to understand the range of dispositionalist views, period. So here I'm borrowing a figure from Father Mariusz's book, where he just lays out different accounts of what dispositional properties are. So what kind of properties are these dispositions or powers? Again, a little bit of debate about the language use there. But insofar as we talk about certain kinds of properties by which something is able to manifest in some way, some people want to say, okay, we want to distinguish between properties that are, properly speaking, dispositional. The idea that salt is soluble, it can dissolve, versus the fact that salt has a mass. That we might talk about sort of categorical features about something that identify what it is, versus dispositional features that relate to how it might manifest under in relation to other causal powers, other dispositions. And again, you can see a taxonomy here where, well, some people want to say, no, there's either all properties are dispositional or all properties are categorical, or there are versions of, yeah, sorry. There are both kinds, but like one is more important. So, there are both categorical and dispositional properties, but you can reduce all categorical properties down to the way things tend to act. Or that, yes, we can talk about dispositional properties, but really those are just the categorical properties and some perhaps language about the way that they might act, a kind of counterfactual language. Again, then there are, kind of arguments of saying, no, there's just both. Arguments of saying, no, they're really just two sides of the same coin. And so for each of these, there's going to be a slightly different account of what that causation looks like. When we talk about what whether or not there is what the manifestation is, what the power is, There's like slight variations in the way you might talk about the causality as well. And similarly, there's questions about these manifestations. How are manifestations related to their powers? There's this sense of a kind of necessary connection, but there are some people who want to say, well, we're going to just turn that around to a kind of counterfactual condition or a subjunctive condition. If the power had been appropriately tested, then the manifestations would occur. Or is there some real natural directedness of the powers towards their manifestations? And there are debates among contemporary philosophers about the best way to account for the relationship between a manifestation and their power, let alone what exactly are these manifestations? Are they just new properties that show up? Are they events? Are they causal processes themselves? So again, there's in this broad camp of dispositionalist view of causality, there's under the hood lots and lots of different views of dispositionalism, many of which might relate to a kind of broadly Thomistic account of how causality works, and yet, properly speaking, to take a kind of, if you're going to onboard a fully Thomistic account of causality, it brings with it a lot of structure about the hylomorphic structure of reality, about the distinction between substantial and accidental forms, about the distinction between active and passive powers. That there's an asymmetry there that is not always present in conversations around dispositionalism. And again, a very strong intuition about teleology, the natural inclination of these powers, that some dispositionalists are perfectly fine with, and others would be very, very resistant to. And so, again, the argument is that there is more structure in the Aristotelian Thomistic account than many dispositionalists might be comfortable with, or different structure. And yet there are interesting openings for broader engagement and conversation. And this kind of dispositionalist conversation about causality is a kind of exciting development in contemporary philosophy of science and contemporary philosophy in general, both in analytic metaphysics and in contemporary philosophy of science. And it's interesting to see kind of where we are today in that conversation versus where we were even when Father Wallace was writing his book in the 1970s, let alone when, some of the early Thomists dealing with contemporary philosophy of science, Maritain, Gilson, were dealing with this. They were dealing with science itself and the philosophy of science and conversations around philosophy and causality in very different places. In some ways, there's a lot more openness to disposition, the notion of causes, the notion of these even something like natures in some of these conversations. So brief concluding thoughts related to divine action. Again, why is it important to begin this conversation on divine action with a kind of review of and taxonomy of conversations around divine action? Well, it's because convictions about the nature and account of causation in general can, and historically have, constrained one's accounts of divine causation and action. I mean, in the most extreme version of this, if your account of causation presumes a kind of fixity of physical laws and a kind of physical closure that rejects it makes the very possibility of divine action difficult, if not impossible, to swallow. There are, and again, there are, it's not surprising perhaps that, more certain strands of philosophy of science that reject the possibility of divine action at all, and argues that the causal closure of the universe doesn't allow for God to do anything that's not already fixed into the pattern of the physical laws. Even if we have maybe a more openness to other ways of talking about divine action, if accounts of causation there all reduce all causality to physical forces, things pushing on things, then divine action in the world is only going to be on the scale of forces and things pushing on things. And so any kind of divine action is and always must be in competition with the physical forces of nature. So even if you're open to the possibility that, yes, perhaps the world isn't causally closed, if your primary and only way of thinking about causality is on this level of physical force, things pushing on things, then how else can God act in the world than by pushing on things? Similarly, if your account of causation that emphasizes probability, kind of leans into questions around quantum mechanics, it might seem that's helpful for accounts of divine action, insofar as there is just a kind of indeterminism in nature, a kind of probabilistic aspect of the way the world works. Perhaps there's enough room in that indeterminism, in that probability, for divine action to fit, that we can find God's providence, even maybe miracles, working in the kind of weirdness of quantum mechanics. And yet, arguably, that might also make divine action necessarily opaque to us, insofar as how do we know if it was divine action or just a random quantum mechanical event? And so, again, these questions about how we diagnose and talk about causality, the role that our understanding of what kinds of causes and effects we countenance, how our understanding of the physical patterns of the world, like what kinds of regularity we expect in the world, they're going to impact the way that we might think about divine action. So with that, the real conclusion of this are here are three really great books on causation in different directions. I recommend all of them. And thank you for your time. And I hope this has been helpful and perhaps inspiring for a deeper dive for you later on.